When Asian American men are underrepresented in leadership, media, and even viewed as least desirable in online dating apps by heterosexual women and gay men, what is going on? When we look at the impact of gendered racism, are there ways we can challenge the socialization experience Asian American men face? How can we intervene at the practice, advocacy, education, and training level? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, a show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zhen. We have a returning guest on our podcast. Dr. Keum is an assistant professor at the Department of Social Welfare at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. As a social justice-oriented scientist practitioner, Dr. Keum has developed a career committed to investigating and addressing discrimination and oppression as social determinants of health and mental health disparities. His research examines online racism, intersectionality in Asian American mental health, multicultural and social justice-oriented psychotherapy, and culturally valid and informed psychometrics. So as part of our AAPI series highlighting the work of AAPI psychologists, Dr. Keum will be discussing his most recent work, particularly in the area of Asian American men's socialization. Dr. Keum, glad to have you back and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be back. So thanks so much for having me again.
Now, today we will be discussing a recent study you conducted and what a wonderful paper you have written about it. At the time of this recording, the paper is in press and should be released soon. The title is Asian American Men's Gendered Racial Socialization and Fragmented Masculinity. For our listeners, first tell us a little bit about how did you come up with the idea to this particular work, and then we'll later on go through some of the terminologies that we may not be familiar with.
Yeah, glad to. So there has been, a lot of interest in the intersectionality, in the past decade or so. That framework has really unlocked opportunities for us to, look at these experiences, for example, that I will be talking about today on Asian American men's gender racial socialization in a way that it needs to be looked at, the lived experiences of that. And so, when you start to consider both, gender and race, and of course, there are additional identities that would require additional examination. But if you look at those two major identities for this group, it's apparent that there is a lot of research that's missing in terms of how they have, in this case, how do Asian, American boys and men, grow up in this country we call United States, and how do they negotiate their, gender racial socialization, their position. How do they understand the discrimination that they experience, the gender racism, which I will talk about more later. And so, when we looked at the literature, there wasn't much information on this. As a person who identifies as Asian American, who grew up in either Canada or the US, where there is this, dominant white hegemonic masculinity ideals, how do we develop our masculinity as Asian American boys and men growing up? And just like how that experience is rarely talked about, rarely represented in the media or in other spheres of culture, in academia and in the study of psychology, and particularly men and masculinities, it is largely absent, which is mind-boggling, because this dominant ideal has been around ever since in the inception of this country, and Asian American boys and men have been experiencing them ever since they were represented in this country. And yet there is no research or no specific source where we can go to and start to understand how did it affect us, growing up, because it is definitely affecting how we view ourselves as men, how society views us as men, and that ultimately affects a lot of issues.
Now, one of the things that I'd be curious about too is there's already certain masculinity models out there. For instance, the one I remember when I was doing research is the gender role conflict model. In what way is what you're proposing different?
So what we are proposing is, implications of this research is that, well, largely it is a model that, not only just focuses on masculinity, but how that masculinity is socialized for Asian American boys and men across their development. So what messages are they receiving interpersonally, at the family level, at the community level, and at the cultural level about who they are as a boy, as a man who's continuing to develop those presentations? And so our charge is that there is a void of how we are actually developing an affirmative identity of masculinity, and that because of that we see a lot of issues that are being internalized. And it does show, in a lot of different aspects in studies where we look at Asian American adults' mental health experiences, and particularly among Asian American men as well. There is a lot of mental health issues that they report, but when we look at some of the more developmental context or the socialization, because these aren't things that just happen one day, right? These symptoms and issues, they don't just develop one day and come out of thin air. It's lifetime of development of issues that have accumulated. And so let's say you go through growing up, being bullied in schools, being affected by gender racism, for example, because of the dominant white supremacist hegemonic masculinity ideals. All those experiences accumulate and start to really eat away, right, at who you are internally as a man and how you develop that identity. How does that position yourself in terms of other men in this country, especially white men? And so it's all relational. Your sense of masculinity as an Asian boy and man is not something that you own. It's really relational in terms of the white hegemonic masculinity ideals that dictate, how you should be, who you should be. And all those stereotypes and stigmas and beliefs against Asian American will try to denigrate them, over time. And so if you are experiencing that over time for over many, many years, and you're not able to really seek appropriate support, develop coping skills, it's really hard. And a lot of the participants that we have interviewed in this study, this is a qualitative study, they overwhelmingly collectively voiced the fact that there was nobody to help them, which was so hard to hear, that there was no model of affirmative gender racial socialization for them.
Yeah, when
Which
I was
then,
reading,
yeah,
I have to say, when I was reading some of the excerpts in the article, it was painful. It was
mhm.
heartfelt painful to hear these participants describe their experience. And and so I'm really glad that you are doing this work. So you also mentioned white supremacist ideal of masculinity. Can you give us a brief overview of possibly what that means behaviorally, and how that doesn't quite explain the Asian American men's experience?
A large part of that is, under the umbrella of this assimilation and trying to be integrated in this country, right? Where, naturally, if you came here by way of immigration, the goal for you is to try and integrate yourself, assimilate into the culture that is dominant in the US. And the dominant culture is, white, cultural, norms, and white supremacist or norms are part of that, cultural norm. And so, when you begin to try and integrate yourself, that a lot of Asian American boys and men will face this issue where, well, being Asian is not the main ideal. It actually is the oppressed ideal in this country, but there's a lot of things that make us needing to integrate into the mainstream society. So what that kind of means is that you start to erase yourselves. You start to oppress your own identities, which we call, in one aspect, internalized racism. But in this case, we would even go so far as to say internalized gender racism, because that's how you're treated in the society. And so when that happens, then, and a lot of our participants also mentioned this, is that they try to survive in this white hegemonic masculinity ideal dominated society where the qualities of a traditional masculine ideology that is imbued through the representation of white men, where you're being dominant, you're independent, you're problem solving, you're emotionally restricted, don't talk about your problems, just be strong, you can get through this. And those are all imbued to be part of this, white hegemonic masculinity ideal. Whereas for Asian American men, the opposite is kind of used to maintain those ideals, which is that they're timid, they're passive, they're not leadership material, they lack charisma. They are not good in sex, they're unmanly, they're not desirable as romantic partners. And we've seen that time and time again in mass media and all these contents that, continue to portray Asian American in those ways. And so that kind of influence is kind of the juxtaposition that happens between those two ideals. And for an Asian American boy and man growing up in this country, that is going to be largely in interpersonal and individual levels. You're going to be experiencing a lot of gender racism, which is that you might be treated as, unmanly, not fit for leadership positions. You're going to be emasculated. We hear this a lot, right, in popular media culture, where people are like, "Oh, I don't date Asian men because they're just not manly. They're just not fit to be a romantic partner." And so the question is, what makes you say that, right? What is going on when you say that? And it's all systemic, right? All of this socialization that we all go through, it's not just Asian American men who experience that. Everybody kind of gets socialized into this ideal where, from early on, they're kind of sent this message: yeah, Asian men are not manly, don't date them. And that gets translated into many different interpersonal experiences for Asian American men. But so that is a large part of how integrated into every facet of the Asian American boy and man experience, which we have some research on. For example, there's more research on gender racism that's beginning to come out. But when we look at the more longitudinal and developmental socialization, or the contextual aspects of how this, permeates even at the age of early childhood, there was nothing there. And which is quite honestly very concerning for me as a person who is really interested in this issue, because how are all the Asian American boys and men surviving? What are they doing, right? Because internally, something's going on, but we don't know that yet. And, some of the more alarming statistics that are coming out recently is that a lot of suicidal ideation and completed suicides are going up in Asian American emerging adulthood, particularly among Asian American men as well. And so what is going on internally? There's a lot of internal shame. There's a lot of internalizing of these issues. And without proper affirmative support, what the outcome might be.
Yeah. I guess thanks for defining what is gendered racism and walking through that process. And so tell me a little bit more about this paper. And I think one of the question I have is, can you define what is a fractured masculinity?
Yeah, so that is the conceptualization that we began to see as we were synthesizing some of the findings. It's this concept that what appears to be a really juxtaposed masculinity, if you will. So fragmented is another word that we use because it feels like it's just unstable. Because, for example, the boys and men they grow up, right, trying to survive within this white hegemonic masculinity ideal by way of trying to be more white, trying to be more like white men, right, trying to, integrate into those norms to survive in the society. And yet back home in your families, in your community, you're expected to be the Asian boy and man, in your own ethnic cultures and community. And in those instances, you also try to have to be, say for me, I have to be aware of the Korean cultural norms, what it's like to be a Korean boy or a man. But what happens is that those kinds of juxtapositions, on one hand, in the society, you're not accepted. You try to integrate, but you're ultimately, not validated or accepted as being an Asian man for all the reasons that we talked about. And then in your ethnic community or in your families, you're also sometimes participants. What they have reported is that you're dinged for trying to be too white. You're like, well, why are you trying to be too white? You're a Korean boy or a man. You should know these cultural norms and values. And then you go out into society, but you have to then emulate, a white person. So you're kind of caught in this kind of bind, right? And so over time, what the participants have, reported is that they just don't have a good sense of who they are as a man in the society. They just don't feel grounded in this, masculinity that they have. And so, what the end result is that there is a lot of identity issue at play. And we know that in psychology, a lot of those identity issues are foundations for mental health issues, behavioral risk symptoms. And so it is kind of very concerning that a lot of men have reported being in this kind of fragmented space. And with that, I think the most concerning thing is that it's all internal. There is not a lot of help that they're looking for and not a lot of help that's being given. Because, as you know, probably, is that a lot of Asian men are traditional as well in terms of masculinity ideals, and a lot of cultures socialize them to be, don't talk about your problems, just work harder, study harder, especially here in the United States, right? When you experience discrimination, ignore it, don't do anything, just work harder and study harder. Just go to a good college, become a doctor, lawyer, it'll solve things. No, it doesn't solve things. So you experience more of them as you go into
Yes.
these
Yes.
spaces. And so, that kind of socialization has been also a big theme among families in Asian American communities,
Yeah.
where it's
Now,
just not helpful.
and I think this is so powerful. It, is it actually kosher for me to share an excerpt from your
Sure, yeah,
paper?
go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
just so I think this is very powerful as it's written, and I hope people can access this article. In fact, we'll include this in the show notes. So it's written, one of the participants stated that he grew up hating himself given his parents' white supremacist socialization practices. And the participant goes on to say,
Mhm.
my parents are fully bought into white supremacy. My mother went to an English Catholic school in India. She'll never admit this, but I'm pretty sure she feels inferior as an Indian. And my grandparents, some were kind of pro British and some were anti British, but just being South Asian. The colonization narrative is huge, and
Mhm.
many Indians have bought into that idea that white is right. When I read that, that was so powerful and painful.
Mhm.
It's an erasure of an identity. And I think what's very beautiful about the way you did the study is it wasn't just East Asians. And I really want to bring that out,
Yeah.
just trying to capture the representation of different Asian Americans, which is why I think it's powerful for me to share that. So, how did you go about recruiting these participants? What were the questions asked? Was it just, hey, we're going to do a study on,
Mhm.
examining gender socialization in Asian American men? Can you walk us through that?
Mhm. Well, first, before I get there, just a quick note is that, and because you brought it up in this excerpt, and I think it's a great point about the colonialized histories of some of these, Asian countries, is that, what we talk about here, we're not trying to necessarily blame, right, the families or the men who are socialized or believe in some of these ideals. It is very systemic and cultural, right, intergenerationally. So we have people who have been oppressed under white hegemonic masculinity ideas and just white superiority norms through historical context, that sometimes it is something you have to do to survive in a country that is dominated by white cultural norms. And so it is a very complicated issue, but I feel that we are talking about it because it has to be named, and that we have to move toward being critical because about the awareness on these issues, which is going to be the first step. And a lot of the times we don't talk about it in those critical ways. So I think that is also a big part of the study. And to kind of go with the recruitment of the participants, the sample was more convenient sample. So we reached out to listservs of, Asian American organizations to recruit these participants. And we were trying to ensure a more diverse, try to include not only East Asians, which are too, too represented in the Asian American studies and the literature, Southeast Asians, South Asians, not just heterosexual Asian American men, also LGBTQ plus identified Asian American men, different maybe generational experiences as well. And so we tried to do that. And the most important thing, and I will say this, is, as you said it as well, the painfulness of it. It was very painful to do these interviews. You said it as well, the painfulness of, reading it and understanding it. The interviews were so painful to do because it was, and because I'm also an Asian American man identified, that maybe there was a lot of things that I shared with the participants. But as I was building rapport and as we were going into the interviews, it was so painful because there was just so much shame involved in how these men were talking about these experiences. They were so, and I was so shocked. I mean, I shouldn't be shocked, but hearing it was shocking, is that every one of them were kind of like, I'm so glad that there is space I can talk about this with you. That outside of this research study, that told me that they really didn't have the space to talk about this, which was so painful for me to hear, and how they felt so shameful. And in some instances, some of the men really could not talk about it. So we had to really spend a lot of time trying to get there together. And
Mm.
so it required a lot of, and thank God maybe I was a counseling psychologist. Maybe if it was, a different person, a professional, there was a lot of, it was literally like doing counseling, because it was such an emotion ridden experience. Even them talking about even all of those bullying experiences that they experienced in their childhood, being called as a boy. Imagine being called you have a small penis as a boy. I mean, who says that, right? And how do you deal with that? And then one of them was like, and then after hearing that, how do you talk about that with your parents? Like,
Yeah.
how do you do that, right? How do you go to your dad and say, hey, dad, somebody called me that I have a small penis? Like, what does that mean? And so if you're a dad, how are you going to respond to that, right? So these were all such a shameful experience that they went through, and they are not getting recognized. Like, schools haven't done a thing as they were growing up. Communities haven't done a thing. The society hasn't done a thing for them. So, it was such a painful process to even do the interview. I actually felt depressed after, because I did all the interviews. I did all 15 interviews, and I felt depressed, honestly, that, wow, like, yeah, I mean, it's great that we're talking about it, but it's so much shame. And so that shame is also something we don't even talk about or study. And so, but yeah, it was a tough study to do, because not because I don't understand what's going on, but because emotionally it's so charged.
Yeah. I really want to thank you for the bravery in being able to ask these questions, to interview the participants, creating space for them to have done that, because your experience did shine out in the paper, because I felt it when I was reading it. I was just
Mhm.
going through it. I mean, also the participant experience. I just felt this immense heaviness of the guilt the participants were facing.
Mhm.
Also, the erasing away of being an Asian man.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Mm. And so you did the recruitment, you did the interviews all on your own. And so can you tell me a little bit about some of the themes you picked out, or what were the findings? And eventually later on, we'll get to some of your recommendations, because I think
Mhm.
that's some of the key pieces that we'd like to highlight for our listeners.
Yeah, so once the paper is officially out, and it will be out in the next, couple of weeks, published online in the Counseling Psychologist, but we also created this nice little artwork, that kind of organizes the themes. And so there's a graph for that. But the general gist of it is that we have laid out at different levels the socialization messages that these Asian American boys and men have recalled. And that starts at the individual interpersonal level, up to the parents, guardian, and family level, and then up to community and institutional level, and then finally the cultural and ideological level. And it's literally, we created this diagram because this is probably, and if you think about, the more widely accepted models, such as the Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, that doesn't apply to Asian American boys and men. And the Black scholars have also, heavily criticized that model, because race is not built into that model. When you think about how boys or a child develops in the society according to that model is very much ingrained with the white child's experience. And so if you start to factor in the race and the gender, perspectives, and how those, what are the experiences of the racially, minoritized individuals in this country, this diagram, I think, better represents how a particular Asian boy might be navigating and going through their life, starting at their early childhood. So, for example, at the individual level, we have things like how they have to start erasing. And this is all based on the participants' reports, how they have to survive by erasing their Asian American manhood and try to be more integrated into the white cultural norms. They rarely experience affirmation. So they do report affirmation, but Normally, we would just say, oh, there's affirmation, and that's the theme we found. No, the theme is that there's rare experiences of affirmation, which is that they rarely get affirmed or validated for being a good boy or a good man according to society's standards. A lot of interpersonal gender racism at the individual level, not only in their friend circles, romantic interests, but also in family. We've had participants tell us that sisters and moms have actually conducted gender racist things to them as they were growing up. A sister might say things like, all Asian American men are boring.
Oh,
I mean, so imagine hearing that from your sister and your family, right? So what that tells us is that, again, like the permeation of this white hegemonic, white supremacist masculinity ideals is not an easy thing to handle, right? It permeates in our families too, especially if the family is not critically aware of these issues. It's going to affect how everybody functions in those dynamics. And then as we get into the family level, there is, again, at the family level, there's, inacceptance of Asian men, as we talked about. And then the big thing was that there was a lot of silencing of what the gender racial experience is like for an Asian American boy or a man. So as I talked to you before, when they went to their parents and said, so and so did this to me, like the small penis example that I talked about before, complete silence. They don't want to talk about it. They're simply saying, just go and study, just go and do better, right? It's almost like you're the problem, right? Society is not the problem. You're the problem. No, but society is the problem. You're not the problem. Participants rarely reported receiving that kind of affirmative message. And then when we go up to the community and institutional level, a lot of institutional gender racism, definitive example being such thing as, not being promoted into leader positions because Asian American men are seen as not charismatic. They lack the leadership quality. If they're seen as a leader, it's probably because in some of these, more Asian dominated careers like the STEM field, they are seen for their skills. But when, as push comes to shove, then they're then questioned about their leadership qualities. We also saw a lot of mass media and popular culture erasure and underrepresentation and misrepresentation of Asian American men, and particularly the geographic and neighborhood influence as well, where boys or men who grew up in areas where it's white, predominantly white individual communities, they have felt even greater erasure of themselves, even greater internalization, even greater isolation of who they are as an Asian man. And so, but then contrast that to those who grew up in more ethnically, rich or ethnically diverse communities, they were actually faring better in those regards.
Oh, wow. That's quite an interesting finding.
Yeah, so some geographic differences that we have to also start to look into, because where you are in this country also heavily dictates how you will be socialized. It is kind of our curiosity there. And then finally, the cultural ideological levels. This is, again, a lot of mass media, pop culture issues. There is a heavy influence from the intergenerational parental ideologies. So as we talked about before, if your parents came over from a country that was heavily influenced by Western cultures, norms, like the example that you read, right? They're going to be then socialized under those kinds of norms. And so if your parents are the one who is saying, oh, to survive in this country, you got to be like the white person, you got to beat the white person, that kind of actually, on one hand, I understand where that's coming from, but on the other hand, as a person growing up in this country, trying to figure out who I am, it's going to be an erasure. And so that's one. And of course, there is a lot of traditional masculinity ideologies, heterosexist ideologies. So, and then of course, the American dream, ideology, where we're here to succeed. We're here to achieve the American dream. Nothing else matters. You just need to go to a good school, become a doctor. Those are the indicators of the American dream. And, all of that comes down to one thing. Who are you, right? As an Asian American boy and a man, like, how do you understand yourself when all of these things tear apart who you're supposed to be, or your actual promise to yourself that I can explore who I am in this country? That opportunity is completely ripped apart as you
Yes.
go through all of these
Yes, and I
levels.
see this, and I think we see this in a lot of our clinical work with Asian American men, as well as Asian Americans in general, achieve a certain status, and then they wonder,
Right.
wait, who am I? What is this
Yeah.
for? Or achieve a certain title, and wait, I can't go up because of this bamboo ceiling.
Right.
So, yeah, what are some key interventions that you would like our listeners to pay attention to or consider?
So first of all, I think that this will provide some greater awareness of some of these overlooked experiences of the socialization that actually represent the lived experiences of these boys and men. So being more aware of what's actually going on, right? Because there's a facade of the model minority that's so pinnacle to how Asian American men are represented in this country. And that's why we see like, really rarely like funding or large scale grants on their experience, that people are easy to overlook sort of what might be happening internally in this group. That's a lot of internalized shame, on a lot of internalized oppression, a lot of internalized undesirable masculinity that is going to continue to show up in many different parts of their lives. In this study, what we also wanted to do is to make sure that we also capture some factors that can also be affirming. And I talked about this before, is that they did receive affirmation. Some participants were able to report that, which they said was great, although it's rare and uncommon. But the question is then, why are they uncommon? Like, why are they rare? Why couldn't we, capitalize on this and actually think about the flip side? There's so much deficit in this study that we talk about. We want to make sure that we also want to make sure that we provide something that is more affirming, hopeful, protective and flourishing, right? For them, for the Asian American boy and men's development. And so, there are in this study, if you get a chance to look, we also in the diagram, we also provide, multi-level protective factors that the readers can kind of visualize. But at the individual level, the participants have talked about things like being able to have some positive body and intimate experiences, being given the opportunity to have some critical education around what it's like to be an Asian American person, and of course, specifically an Asian American man, developing cross-racial male solidarity, not just among Asian American men, but with other men of color as well, or even white men in some instances. And in terms of at this level, what was also very important was that participants who said they could emotionally connect with other Asian American men and form that emotional bonding felt really good and could really feel like they could be grounded in those aspects. I think that is an experience that is largely disconnected in our Asian American communities. I don't know, like it just felt to me that the participants were saying that in the community, it's hard for Asian American men to connect emotionally, which is something that they all yearned, which is the irony here, because every one of them wants to connect emotionally, but because of the norms, not just the white hegemonic masculinity ideals, but the traditional masculine ideologies, it prevents them from being able to emotionally connect. And so that, I think, is something where a lot of the therapists and a lot of professionals can really help forge some of those emotional connections and what it means to actually be vulnerable, be expressive emotions, be reciprocating in those emotional contexts. And when you go into the family level, the biggest thing here was that how do we promote families to talk about gender racism? How do we get them to talk about their gender racial experiences? How do we get them to be more critical about what this means for them and their boy or emerging man, adulthood? And how can they provide socio-emotional support? How can they develop some scaffold to help them cope with the potential gender racism that they might experience? And then at the community and the cultural level, how do we provide more access to these boys and men, to public leaders, Asian American men leaders who are already breaking stereotypes in the community? Because a lot of them did say they had to find their own ways to access or idealize Asian American men who actually is trying to break these stereotypes. And in the paper, there are many examples of them. And not just in the media, but in workplaces as well, right? Do you have a Asian American male mentor in your workplace who you can look up to, who can actually, give you that sense of hopefulness. A lot of men also talked about being able to travel back to their country of origin was really helpful because it actually gave them a sense of pride, a sense of foundation that, oh, wow, yeah, all of this is there. There is a country where that they do actually affirm a lot of what I have. And, being able to have that experience early on, I think was really helpful for them. So I'm not necessarily saying that you should go and travel to your country of origin, but what does that mean, right? Because that ideal, right? How can we talk about that, process that experience in other ways that could be helpful? And finally, of course, there is a lot of, I think, yearning among these men in terms of opportunities to really continue to own critical education on these awareness issues. Not just, and here's one thing that I will say is that a lot of the men said this happened for them in college. It did not happen for them at all until they hit college. So they missed all of that opportunity when they were growing up, when they probably needed it more. So they only got it when they're in college. So then comes a lot of resentment. Then comes a lot of shame that, oh my God, like, why didn't I look at this before, right? So how can we promote more of that in the growing up experience? And how do we also advocate for more affirmative and representative, cultural representation of these men, not just in the media, in schools, in communities, and workplaces? A lot of men also talked about how social media is now becoming a really great tool for that. You actually go on social media like YouTube. Now you actually have a lot of Asian American men putting out content that really affirms or is advocating for their masculine identity and talking about critical racial issues and gender issues. And so being exposed to that and being able to use that to your advantage, I think is also going to be very important. And so in those contexts, I think that mental health professionals and other professionals should definitely take note of that, because it is ongoing and it's not something that can be solved, right, as you know, but it is a lifelong kind of negotiation that we have to go through as Asian American boys and men, as long as we live in this country, and even beyond this country. Like the norms are pretty oppressive, and so the white hegemonic masculinity ideals, and so that constant reflection and work, not just individually, but by other parties, the family, the community, the media, has to all happen. Because, and that's the last thing I'll say here, is that every one of them was like, why do I have to do this? Why am I put in the position of needing to survive like this? Why isn't nobody helping me? Why is my family also overlooking this experience? Why are schools not doing anything? Why is my workplace continuing to treat me this way? So, yes.
Well, you and I know that some of this is probably the whole model minority myth.
Right. That also plays a big factor into this. And, just I think what they're trying to say is that we are tired of just trying to survive on our own. There needs to be more done around us to advocate for our affirmation. And I think in today's society because, even a decade ago, I think psychology was so individual, that it was so intrapersonal. Like, you have to do something. What can we do? What are some coping skills you can get, you can develop for yourself? That's great. That's fine. But that doesn't solve the issue, right? It just prolongs the resolution. And so I think we are at a really, interesting time where a lot of transformations are happening in many parts of our society, where I think in this case too, I think we need more societal transformations, and we're beginning to see some of that, but we really need to go strong force on that. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Keum. Well, thank you very much for your time and sharing this fascinating and important study. So let's see, any last thoughts?
No, I think I really had a really passionate time, talking about this. So I really thank for the opportunity to do this. And, I'm glad that this paper is coming out, but more glad the participants' experiences are being represented, that, their stories are being told, and it's going to be more represented in the literature. And I hope that this opens more doorways to really study ways to provide affirming, right, socialization for the participants, and of course the broader groups as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Keum.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology.